Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to look at the question, can we talk about everything where this is completely unrestricted? Can there be inquiry of absolute generality, inquiry about all things without qualification? Or more technically, is there unrestricted quantification? So our language contains terms like every, all, some, most, there is at least one, etc. These are quantifiers which tell us information about how many things in a given domain have some property. And under normal circumstances, these quantifiers will be restricted to some specific domain. Here's an example. Suppose we're at a party and I say, all of the beer is in the fridge. Now let's say the sentence is true. Well, of course, it's not the case that all of the beer in the world is in the fridge. What I'm saying is that all of the beer in the house is in the fridge, or all of the beer that I own is in the fridge. So this phrase, all of the beer, well, I mean, I'm not quantifying over everything without restriction. I'm quantifying over a restricted domain, namely the beer that I own. So we have a domain of entities, namely beers owned by me, and this says that all of these entities are placed in the fridge. Or suppose I say something like, there is nothing in the cupboard. But, of course, there are shelves in the cupboard, there's dust in the cupboard, maybe there's spiders in the cupboard. I mean, when I say there's nothing in the cupboard, I'm not talking about all physical objects. I'm saying that no objects of a certain kind are in the cupboard. Maybe there's no clothes in the cupboard, or no games in the cupboard, or nothing in the cupboard that needs to be packed up into boxes if we're moving house, say. So, usually when I use these quantifiers, the domain of quantification is restricted in various ways. I mean, arguably, the vast majority of cases where we use words like every and none and so on in day-to-day life, I mean, in the vast majority of those cases, we're quantifying only over a restricted domain. So our question is, can there be quantification over an absolutely general domain? That is, can we talk about everything that there is without restriction? This is unrestricted quantification. So, absolutists say yes. Sometimes we can quantify over everything without restriction. We can talk about absolutely everything, no exceptions. There is a domain that comprises every object, no exceptions. Relativists say no. They say that unrestricted quantification is not possible. There is no absolutely general domain. So, just to make a couple of clarificatory points here. First of all, absolutism does not say anything about what there is. It says only that whatever there is, it is in the absolutely general domain. So, if there are abstract objects, as Platonists would say, then those abstract objects are in the absolutely general domain. If there are merely possible objects, then those objects are in the absolutely general domain. If there are non-existent objects, as Meinongians say, well, they're in the absolutely general domain, and so on. But the absolutist does not, in virtue of her absolutism, claim that there are abstract objects, or merely possible objects, or non-existent objects, or whatever. Just that whatever there is, there's an absolute domain, such that everything is in that domain. The absolutist says that we can quantify over everything there is. It's going to be a further question what there is. So, arguably, many philosophical theories seem to presuppose that unrestricted quantification is possible. Consider physicalism. Physicalism asserts everything is physical. There are no non-physical things. And here the physicalist means to describe absolutely everything without restriction. It wouldn't be much of an interesting thesis if the physicalist were claiming, for instance, that, well, everything in space and time is physical. If there's any exception whatsoever to the physicalist's thesis, any non-physical stuff, regardless of what its other properties are, then physicalism is false. Or consider nominalism. The nominalist says everything is concrete. There are no abstract objects. Here, the nominalist means to describe absolutely everything without restriction. It wouldn't be much of an interesting thesis if the nominalist were claiming, for instance, that everything in space and time is concrete. There are no abstract objects in space and time. Indeed, that would be kind of trivial, because abstract objects are often defined as non-spatiotemporal. So if there is any exception whatsoever to the nominalist's thesis, any abstract object at all, then nominalism is false. Or when talking about logical properties, we might say everything is identical with itself. We affirm the law of identity, and that's intended to be that's about absolutely everything without restriction. There cannot be any exception to it. So, in stating these positions, it looks like we're using unrestricted quantification. So it's an interesting point to note, I think, that philosophical theories, as they're, a lot of like traditional philosophical theories seem to require this. Now, I mean, it might look kind of obvious that unrestricted quantification is possible. I've just given some examples of it, haven't I? But there are arguments against unrestricted quantification. And I guess if these arguments are successful, then it looks like we're going to have to rethink how we frame many of our philosophical positions. Maybe metaphysics becomes impossible, at least as it's traditionally conceived as dealing with reality or being in the most general sense. So, relativism maybe raises a challenge here. But why take relativism seriously? So the central argument here appeals to the idea of indefinitely extensible concepts. So Salvatore Florio, in the article Unrestricted Quantification, characterizes an indefinitely extensible concept as a concept, and I quote, such that if we can form a definite conception of a totality, all of whose members fall under the concept, we can, by reference to that totality, characterize a larger totality, all of whose members fall under it. So, putting it in the abstract, then the idea is this. We take some concept, P, right? So we say, like, all things that are P. I form this idea of all things that are P. Now, P will be indefinitely extensible if, by reference to all things that are P, I can characterize more stuff. I can characterize a larger totality of things such that this larger totality also instantiates P. So I start off with like all things that are P, and then it turns out, well, actually, no, I can now characterize more things that are P. I'm never going to be able to reach a final totality of things that are P. One context in which this has been applied is Russell's paradox in set theory. Now, for our purposes, it suffices to think of sets as collections of objects where any kind of object can be a member of a set. So we have what's known as the unrestricted comprehension principle, which says that for any well-defined property, there is a set of all and only those objects that have that property. I might have, for instance, the set of all blue objects. This would be the set that contains the sky, the cup on my desk, the planet Neptune, the Earth's ocean, and so on. Or I might have the set of all objects within my room. Or I might have the set of all objects that came within 10 meters of Frank Zappa. Or I might have the set of all abstract objects. So any property at all, right, as long as it's a well-defined property, we can have a set of all and only those objects that have that property. And importantly, this means that there can also be sets of sets, because a set is itself a kind of object. Object doesn't have to be like physical, concrete object. We can also be talking about like mathematical objects and so on. So there can be sets that contain sets. So that is a set whose members are themselves all sets. For instance, there's the set of all sets that contain blue objects as members. And also, there can be sets that contain themselves as members. For instance, the set of all sets that have more than one member. Since there are multiple sets that have more than one member, this set contains more than one member. So this set is itself a member of the set of all sets that contain more than one member. So this is the idea, right? You can the sets of pretty much any object. There's sets of sets. There's sets that contain themselves. So yeah. Now with that said, we now consider the set R, where R is the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. So that's how it would be written formally there, right? The set X such that X is not a member of X. X is not an element of X. Okay, suppose I affirm that there is such a set. So I say, there is a Y such that for all X, X is a member of Y if and only if X is not a member of Y. This basically just affirms the existence of this set R, right? The set of all sets that are not members of themselves. The trouble is that this leads to contradiction. At least if we take it that the universal quantifier, where we say for all X, if we take it that this is unrestricted, so it ranges over all sets without restriction, it ranges over the absolutely general domain, in that case we get a contradiction as follows. Is R a member of itself? Well, suppose that R is a member of itself. Well, in that case, since it is the set of all sets that are not members of themselves, it's not a member of itself, which is a contradiction. Okay, now suppose that R is not a member of itself. Well, in that case, it has the property of not being a member of itself, so it must be a member of the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. Again, a contradiction. Now, either way, we end up with a contradiction. We end up having to say that R both is and is not a member of itself. At least that's how things might initially seem, but if we deny unrestricted quantification, we can take it that for any given domain, there is indeed a set. So we can say for any given domain, there's a set that is not in the domain of the universal quantifier. So we basically reinterpret the previous. So we said, there is a y such that for all x is a member of y if and only if x is not a member of y. Basically, we reinterpret this so that when we say there is a y, this extends the domain of for all x. So for all x has like a more restricted domain than there is a y. So the set of all sets that are not member of themselves is not a member of itself, but this doesn't lead to contradiction because the phrase all sets is referring to a restricted domain. So basically, I mean, one way to look at this is that the set of all sets that are not members of themselves could be reinterpreted to mean the set of all sets from domain D that are not members of themselves, and then this set, the set of all sets from domain D that are not members of themselves, this set is not itself in domain D, right? This is the general idea. This set is from a larger domain. So we've sort of, whenever we have this set R, we kind of have to step into a larger domain. So Florio summarizes the point. He says, the set of all non-self-membered sets the set of all non-self-membered sets in the initial domain cannot, on pain of contradiction, be in that domain, which means it must lie in a more comprehensive domain of all sets. So on this view, set is an indefinitely extensible concept. So this is an example of one kind of concept that would be indefinitely extensible. There is actually a more sort of direct argument against unrestricted quantification that appeals to sets, and this is that the domain of quantification is often understood in terms of sets. It's often understood directly in terms of sets. So according to what's called the all-in-one principle, a domain is a set whose members are the objects in the domain. So when I say all the beer is in the fridge, the domain is the set whose members are all the alcoholic drinks that I own. And my statement is true just in case all the members of that set do indeed have the property of being in my fridge. So when we quantify over certain objects, we presuppose that these objects constitute a further object, namely a set of those objects. So suppose then that there is unrestricted quantification. Well, then on this view, this would involve quantification. So unrestricted quantification is quantification over a domain containing all objects. Now, by the all-in-one principle, this domain would be a set that contains all objects as its members. But Russell's paradox shows that there cannot be a domain that contains all objects as its members. So suppose that D is the absolutely general domain. Then there's another domain, D star, which contains all and only the objects in D that are not members of themselves. D star is just a restricted domain of D. So now, if D star is a member of D, we get Russell's paradox. Because if D star is a member of D, then we can ask whether D star is a member of D star. And then we've just faced the paradox we've already outlined. On the other hand, if D star is not in D, then contrary to our hypothesis, D is not the domain associated with unrestricted quantification, because there's something outside of D. So, yes, I mean, this is the idea, right? We're appealing to this famous paradox in set theory to argue against unrestricted quantification. Now, there are obviously there are other ways of responding to Russell's paradox. The standard response would just be to deny that any condition defines a set. So we deny unrestricted comprehension. So there is no set R. There is no set of all sets that are not members of themselves. There's going to be a distinction between conditions that define a set and conditions that do not. So we can quantify over an absolutely general domain, and there's no problem because there just is no set of all sets that are not members of themselves within that domain. There just is no such set, period. And so that solves the problem. So here's one response to this. This comes from Kit Fine in his article, Relatively Unrestricted Quantification. So he argues that this move doesn't really help. And as I understand what he's saying, his article's a little bit unclear to me, but if I'm understanding it correctly, I think his point is this. So he says, well, look, for any given condition, we can understand the quantifier such that it ranges over a set whose members are all those objects that satisfy the condition. Now, the question of how many, if any, objects actually satisfy the condition is irrelevant to our understanding of the quantifier. I think Fine's point here is that even if there is no set R, we can still understand it and talk about it, and we still have a concept of it, and that's all that's required for the indefinite extensibility argument to go through. Remember, the idea is that, so the thought is set is an indefinitely extensible concept, and of course we can have concepts of things that don't exist. I can have the concept unicorn even if there are no unicorns. More importantly, so the thought would be, well, by restricting what conditions can legitimately define a set, what we show is we show how to develop a consistent set theory within a given domain, regardless of whether that domain is unrestricted. But that's only going to be one way among many of understanding the concept set. So like, okay, the way to put it is, in standard set theory, there is no set R, right? This allows standard set theory to be consistent, even when, you know, we claim to be speaking in absolutely general terms. But nothing stops us from using a slightly different concept of set, a concept that allows us to define set R and thereby is incompatible with an unrestricted domain. So we might say, like, the concept of set in standard set theory is not indefinitely extensible. The concept of set in naive set theory is indefinitely extensible, so we have an indefinitely extensible concept. Okay then, just a brief advert. If you like my videos, you can support me on Patreon. I upload bonus videos on Patreon, so you know, you get something in return for it. Or if you just want to send me some money via PayPal, I would appreciate that as well. I mean, anything you can do to help the channel is really appreciated. It takes a lot of work to do these videos, so like I said, you know, every little helps. Even if that's just giving the video a like and leaving a comment, any kind of engagement helps the video get seen. So I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. I did a degree, a master's and a PhD in philosophy, so you know, that's my background. So if you're interested in that, send me an email, and all the links to this will be in the description. Okay, let's move on. So okay, I want to take another example of an indefinitely extensible concept. So here's another, well, potential example, arguable example. This arises with respect to the principle of sufficient reason, and this is discussed in Samuel Levy's paper, The Paradox of Sufficient Reason. All right, the principle of sufficient reason states that for any fact f, there is a fully sufficient reason why f is the case. Any fact is explicable. There are no brute facts. There are no facts that in principle cannot be explained. So this is, I mean, you know, if you have an interest in metaphysics, you've probably encountered this principle at one time or another. Now, there's a famous argument from Peter van Inwagen that the principle of sufficient reason entails that there are no contingent truths. So the principle of sufficient reason entails necessitarianism, that every truth is a necessary truth. So it turns out, for instance, that like the fact that I'm currently recording a video on a computer, this could not have been otherwise. It's just it's a necessary truth. There's no other possible way the universe could have been, and that's the case for every truth that there is. So that's a, you know, pretty radical conclusion. Now Levy modifies van Inwagen's argument to argue instead that the concept contingent truth is indefinitely extensible. So contingent truth. So I mean, basically, I'll go through van Inwagen's argument first. So here's how he presents it. Right. Suppose first of all that C is the conjunction of all contingent truths. Okay, so we just start out with, I mean, you know, if we think that there are contingent truths, then we can presumably just take the conjunction of all those truths. So we start out with all the contingent truths. Well, then notice that, first of all, C cannot be necessary, because obviously if C were necessary, then it would not be a conjunction of all contingent truths. The conjunct of a necessary truth cannot be contingent. So if the conjunction P and Q is necessary, well, P has to be necessary and Q has to be necessary. If P could have been otherwise, if there's some outcome where P doesn't hold, then clearly the conjunction P and Q could have been otherwise. So the conjunction C, that can't be necessary. Okay, so C is contingent, and what that means is that by the principle of sufficient reason, well, there must be some fact F that provides a fully sufficient reason for C. For any fact, there has to be a fully sufficient reason why it's the case. So here, our fact is just the conjunction of all of the contingent truths that there are. That's contingent. That could have been otherwise. So we need to give some account of why it is so. Why is it the case? It can't just be a brute fact that this conjunction holds. So there's some fact F that provides a fully sufficient reason for C. But now we can ask, is F a contingent truth? Well, if F is a contingent truth, then F must be a member of C, right? Because C is the conjunction of all contingent truths. But that would mean that by explaining C, F would explain itself. But it makes no sense to say that a contingent truth could explain itself. I mean, maybe a necessary truth could explain itself in some sense, you know, because a necessary truth could not have been otherwise. But a contingent truth is a truth that could have been otherwise. So there has to be some reason why it holds. So okay, F can't be a contingent truth. On the other hand, if we say that F isn't a contingent truth, then it's a necessary truth. But F provides a fully sufficient explanation for C. Given that F is the case, C must be the case. F entails C. And anything entailed by a necessary truth must itself be a necessary truth. So if F is a necessary truth, then C is a necessary truth. So we can see that given the principle of sufficient reason, there can be no conjunction of all contingent truths. And Van Inwagen concludes, well, okay, given the principle of sufficient reason, there just can't be any contingent truths then. All truths are necessary. Once you have the principle of sufficient reason in place, it just turns out this idea of contingent truth is incoherent. That's Van Inwagen's argument. That's the argument that the principle of sufficient reason entails necessitarianism. Now, what Levy points out is this argument rests on the following assumption. It assumes the following. If there are any contingent truths, then there is a conjunction of all contingent truths. Right? If there are any contingent truths at all, then there's such a thing as all contingent truths. But an alternative approach here is to take it that contingent truth is indefinitely extensible, in which case there is no such thing as all contingent truths, completely unrestricted. So we can basically just reframe the Van Inwagen argument as follows. Here's how Levy puts it, right? So we start out, we say, look, C is a collection of all contingent truths. Given the principle of sufficient reason, there must be a fact F that provides a sufficient explanation for C. F cannot be included in C because then F would be self-explaining, and we're saying that doesn't make sense. F cannot be necessary because then C would be necessary. So F is a contingent truth that is not included in C. Now, we could of course stipulate, some new collection. We could say C star is the collection of contingent truths that includes both everything in C and F. But now we just run the same argument on C star. So contingent truth is indefinitely extensible. There's no such thing as all contingent truths. I mean, the general sort of thought here is, suppose we accept the principle of sufficient reason. Now, this is obviously a very controversial metaphysical principle, but if we accept it, then what we're going to say is that any contingent truth must have some explanatory ground. And that explanatory ground must be some other contingent truth. Because otherwise, if the explanatory ground was necessary, then obviously the thing that we've considered to be a contingent truth couldn't be a contingent truth. It would be entailed by a necessary truth. So the explanatory ground is some other contingent truth, and therefore it itself calls for some other contingent truth as its explanatory ground. So, as Levy puts it, and I quote, an unending explanatory order of contingent truths reveals itself in this way, what we might call a contingent rational order. But then, of course, we can go a bit further. We can say, well, why does this unending rational order obtain? Why is there this whole infinite rational order? And again, there must be some further explanatory ground. So we now get like another unending explanatory order. So the basic picture here is that any contingent truth must be part of a contingent rational order, and for any contingent rational order there'll be some further contingent explanatory ground, and it just goes on, and we can never sort of capture all the contingent truths. Or another way to put this is, like, for any set of contingent truths, we can step back from the set and ask for its contingent explanatory ground, in which case we have a new set of contingent truths, and then we can step back from that and ask for its contingent explanatory ground, and so on. And there's no end to this process of stepping back. Even supposing that there's an infinite order of contingent truths doesn't stop it, because we can just step back from the infinite order and ask, well, why does that infinite order obtain? So there can never be a completed domain of contingent truths. And so, yeah, I mean, given the way that the principle of sufficient reason conceives of contingent truth, hopefully it's clear why there's no such thing as all contingent truths. And the basic point, then, of this indefinite extensibility argument is, as Levy puts it, we come to understand the concepts by coming to grasp rules for constructing or defining instances. And through this, we see that there can be no end to the process. So the point here is just to illustrate the idea of an indefinitely extensible concept. I mean, again, it's obviously we can question the principle of sufficient reason. That might end up being false, and everything that we've said about the set theory paradoxes and stuff. I mean, again, there's plenty of other responses available. I'm just trying to illustrate the sort of general structure of this indefinite extensibility argument. So this is one of the reasons why people might think that unrestricted quantification is just not possible. So the indefinite extensibility argument is, as far as I know, it's widely considered to be the most powerful argument against unrestricted quantification. There are other arguments, however, and so I'll just look at one more. Another argument that's been suggested is, I guess, the argument from conceptual frameworks. So basically the idea is that what exists is relative to a conceptual or linguistic framework. And this kind of follows the ideas in Carnap's Empiricism, Semantics and Ontology. I have a video that explains Carnap's position in more detail. I'll link that in the comments. But the basic idea is this. Carnap draws a distinction between internal questions and external questions. So let's consider the following question. Is there a prime number greater than 100? Well, the natural interpretation of this is that I'm just asking about what follows within the framework of arithmetic. And to answer it, we would apply the definitions and the rules of that framework. I mean, it's pretty clear, right? When you have the definitions of terms like number and prime, okay, we have those definitions, and then we just apply the rules of arithmetic. From that, we can show that, well, 101 is greater than 100, and 101 is prime. So yes, there are prime numbers greater than 100. We're answering an internal question here. We're just sort of doing arithmetic, right? Now consider the question, do numbers exist? Well, we can interpret this as an internal question, as a question like the previous question. And in that case, the answer is trivial, because we just take the rules and the definitions in the framework of arithmetic, and we can show, as we've just noted, right, we can show that 101 is a prime number greater than 100. It follows from this that 101 is a number, and it's going to follow then that, well, there exists an x such that x is a number. So numbers exist, yes. There you go, trivial. Now, philosophers also ask this question. Philosophers ask, do numbers exist? But when philosophers ask this question, they're not asking, some trivial internal question whether numbers exist given the framework of arithmetic. That's not what they're asking. They're asking an external question about the framework of arithmetic as a whole. They're asking something like, does the framework of arithmetic correspond to an independent reality? Like, they're trying to step outside of the framework of arithmetic and then assess whether that framework matches, the independent world. That's the sort of thing that philosophers are doing when they say, do numbers exist? Now, this question on Carnap's view is just nonsensical, right? If we ask this, so if we try to say, like, do numbers exist in the sense of, like, does the framework of arithmetic correspond to reality or something like that? Carnap just says, well, it's meaningless. All we can do, the only sensible question that can be asked at this point is the practical question of whether it would serve our interests to adopt the framework of arithmetic. So, like, we have this language available. We have this sort of set of definitions and rules and so on. And now we just have this pragmatic question of, like, well, is it useful for us to adopt this? And that's it. And then if we adopt it, we can then start asking questions like, well, are there prime numbers greater than 100? And we answer these existence questions within the framework of arithmetic. But once we step outside the framework, those questions become meaningless. So the basic idea is that whether or not something exists can only make sense within a linguistic framework. And the acceptance of a framework is simply a pragmatic matter. It's just going to be a matter of what serves our goals best. I mean, as it happens, probably, arithmetic probably does serve our goals very, very well. I mean, there's all sorts of situations in which we want to use it, but again, it's just pragmatic. So, okay, how does all of this relate to unrestricted quantification? I mean, the idea would be something like this. We'd want to say, well, there is no framework-independent fact of the matter about what exists. And if there is no framework-independent fact of the matter about what exists, then there can't really be an absolutely general domain. The most that we could hope for is a domain that's absolutely general relative to one or another conceptual framework. I mean, one way to look at this is to say, like, if you try to attribute a property to everything, like you say, everything is P, okay? Well, even if you intend to be speaking unrestrictedly, it's always going to be possible for me to come along and just introduce something that's not P by introducing a new linguistic framework. I can just postulate a new framework, and then people might decide to adopt that. And crucially, there's no fact of the matter whether that framework is true or false, right? There's only the practical question of whether it would be useful for us to speak in the terms of that framework, whether it would be useful for us to adopt that framework. So that's the challenge. I mean, I suppose you might say, well, why not say that unrestricted quantification just ranges over all possible frameworks or something like that? Can't I take all possible frameworks? Well, I mean, it seems like this is going to presuppose something like a kind of framework of all frameworks, as it were. The trouble is that it looks like there are some frameworks that actively conflict. So here's an example from Putnam. Imagine a world containing 3 atoms. And then we ask, how many objects are there in this world? So if you're a mereological nihilist, you will say that there are 3 objects. If you're a mereological, because for the mereological nihilist, there are no composite objects. There are only as many objects as there are simple atoms. A mereological universalist, on the other hand, would say there are 7 objects because there are the 3 atoms, and then there's every possible combination of those atoms. For the mereological universalist, any 2 objects compose a further object. Composition is completely unrestricted. And of course, there are various other object frameworks we might adopt here. But, I mean, already we can see a conflict here, because the nihilist says there's 3 objects, the universalist says there's 7 objects. And on this sort of Carnapian view, neither is correct or incorrect. There's not any fact of the matter how many objects there really are. All we can say is how many there are within a given framework. And, if you were to say, well, we just take both frameworks, I mean, I suppose the worry would be, well, it looks like, it looks like if you sort of just try to kind of have both of them, then you're going to have to say something like, well, there's both 3 objects and 7 objects. Or maybe what you end up saying is something like, there are 7 objects. Okay, so there's like the mereological universalist framework gives us 7 objects. Mereological nihilists will kind of agree with 3 of those objects. So you'd almost be saying that, like, the mereological nihilist is taking a more restricted domain. But really, the unrestricted domain is the mereological universalist domain, where there are 7 objects. And then, mereological nihilists are just like restricting, when they talk about objects, they're just kind of restricting their quantifiers to the simple objects, the non-composite objects, of which there are three. But the point is that in that case, you're not really adopting the mereological nihilist framework. You're just adopting the mereological universalist framework with a restricted domain. So arguably, right, these frameworks conflict. Another example of this would be, like a physicalist framework, which says that all objects are physical, versus a phenomenalist framework, which says that all objects are just patterns of sensory impressions. It seems like you can't really take both of those frameworks as one, as it were, because, if you take both of them as defining what exists, then you kind of have to say that they're both false, in a sense, right? Because the physicalist framework says, well, all objects are physical. So if you then say, well, actually, no, there's these objects that are just patterns of sensory impressions, understood as the phenomenalist understands it, then that's something non-physical. Yes, this seems to be a genuine conflict. And so, we can't just kind of capture them within a sort of large conjunction of frameworks. More broadly, I guess, recall that the absolutist does not say anything about what there is. The absolutist says, whatever there is, it's in the absolutely general domain. Now, the point here is that there's no fact of the matter about what there is. So there is no determinate domain that can count as the absolutely general domain. So, okay, those were some of the motivations for relativism. For the denial of unrestricted quantification. Now, there is a major problem for relativism, and this is sometimes called the ineffability objection. According to the ineffability objection, it isn't really possible for the relativist to assert her own position. Relativism ends up being ineffable. We can't really understand what the relativist is even saying. Let's say that the relativist characterizes her position this way. So she says, it is impossible to quantify over absolutely everything. That seems about right, yeah? But notice that as the relativist sees it, when she says absolutely everything here, this can only range over a restricted domain. So what this says, on her view, is that it's impossible to quantify over everything that is in a restricted domain. But obviously that's not what the relativist wants to say. That's not what the relativist wants to say. And indeed, it's straightforwardly false. Obviously, it's possible to quantify over everything in some restricted domain. Just consider the domain consisting of all the beer that I own, right? Okay, this doesn't work. Well, Florio then suggests the following formulation. We might try this. We might say, for every domain D, there is an X such that X is not in D. That is, no domain is unrestricted. For any domain we specify, we can identify something outside of that domain. That seems more in the spirit of the indefinite extensibility argument, at least. But now the obvious problem is this. What is the domain of this very proposition? So R2, for every domain there is an X such that X is not in D. What is the domain of R2? If R2 doesn't quantify over absolutely everything, then it remains possible that there is a domain outside the domain of quantification of R2 that does contain absolutely everything. So when we say for every domain D, is that unrestricted? Are we taking everything unrestrictedly? Because when we say for every domain D, if that's restricted, if we're taking a restricted domain there, so we got like a domain of domains, we have domains within our domains. So when we say for every domain D, if this is a case of restricted quantification, then R2 might be true, but then there might be a domain outside of that domain of quantification where it is an absolutely general domain. Okay, that doesn't work. On the other hand, if the domain of R2 is, if it is absolutely general, if it does quantify over absolutely everything, then it's false by its own lights. So basically, right, we're saying, okay, if the domain of R2 is not absolutely general, then it just fails to rule out the existence of an absolutely general domain. If the domain of R2 is absolutely general, well, then we can have unrestricted quantification, and so the relativist is wrong. So the relativist faces a dilemma. She tells us that there's no absolutely general domain, but what's the domain of her assertion? If the domain is not absolutely general, she hasn't ruled out the absolutely general domain, so she has failed to express her position. If the domain is absolutely general, then her assertion in itself illustrates the falsity of her own thesis. The problem is that in order to even express her own view, it seems that the relativist must use precisely the kind of quantification that she says is impossible. I mean, more generally, recall the point made earlier that relativism seems to rule out a certain kind of philosophical position, right? When we state philosophical positions as, universal claims that like every entity has a certain property or there are no entities of a certain kind, well, absolutism and relativism are philosophical positions of just this sort. So relativism seems to rule out exactly the kind of philosophical position of which it is an example. Now, there are technical attempts to solve this sort of problem, but here's, maybe just a simpler line that the relativist might take. Maybe the relativist should just grant that she can't actually assert a position. Instead, what she should do is aim only to reveal a confusion that is made on the part of the absolutist. So essentially the argument could be that the absolutist has bought into a tempting metaphysical picture, but this picture runs into paradoxes. Now, the relativist does not replace this picture with a different picture. There is no alternative picture. There is no proposition that captures the way things are in this respect. In response to absolutism, all we can do is point to arguments like indefinite extensibility, and those arguments reveal the confusion in the absolutist views, and that's that. So we're sort of taking a leaf from Wittgenstein's book. Wittgenstein held that philosophers cannot assert true philosophical positions. Rather, the task of philosophy can only be to show the confusions into which other philosophers have fallen due to their being misled by certain features of our language. Sometimes, in order to reveal these confusions, we might say things that sound as if they are the assertions of substantial philosophical positions, but then we should be led to see that these assertions are themselves subject to the critique. So you have to throw away the ladder after you've climbed it, as Wittgenstein would have said. And if the relativist takes this view, then she gives up on the idea that philosophy consists in asserting true propositions about the way the world is. And as we said, maybe that's more in line with the spirit of relativism. As we saw earlier, if unrestricted quantification is off the table, it looks like philosophical positions, as they are standardly conceived at least, many philosophical positions are off the table also. So Kit Fine, in his paper Relatively Unrestricted Quantification, summarizes this Wittgensteinian idea as follows. There is therefore nothing for the enlightened philosopher to assert that is both true and of interest. All he can sensibly do is wait for a less enlightened colleague to say something false, though potentially of interest, and then show him to be wrong. And similarly, it seems in the present case. The proposition that some particular interpretation of the quantifier is absolutely unrestricted is of interest only if true, and given that it is false, all we can sensibly do as enlightened relativists is to hope that our opponent will claim to be in possession of an absolutely unrestricted interpretation of the quantifier and then use the extensibility argument to prove him wrong. Well, that's that. That's all for today. Hope that was interesting. I'm going to leave it there. So thanks for watching. Goodbye, everybody.